Hello, it's been quite a while, so let me just check. Power, recording, and the microphone's on. This is Punch Fundamentals 2.5. I think perhaps for the series it'll always be helpful to have a second video, and it's useful, as I've said before, if people make comments that give you something to respond to. It's much easier than trying to think of something to make a video about by yourself. I haven't made a video for a while. I'll talk about that in a little while. I think it's always best to talk about what you've been doing and what your plans are later on in the video. And I should have taken care of an itchy nose before filming as well. I'll just get on with this one. Now, in response to the previous Punch Fundamentals Part 2, which was focused on power, it seems like a reasonable place for it to come up. I had some comments and discussions with people about pushing punches. And it's an interesting subject. It's something that I've seen discussed before online, and because of the subject coming up, I've looked at it a bit more, got a few parts to this, and hopefully we'll learn a little bit about the subject, about some misconceptions, and also about where it's not necessarily the worst thing you can do if you're punching. Let's go. First of all, let's look at what is a push. And I don't think everybody who talks about pushing punches is necessarily referring to the same thing. At some points it's obvious. People talk about snapping punches. That's snapping. It's also a pretty useless punch. I feel sometimes people want so badly to put it back quickly that they're not having any effect on the target. And if you're going to do damage to something, going to put some energy into it, you need to contact, and you might even want to keep moving a moment or two after contact. Get into more details about that. This is obviously going a bit too far, and it's more push than punch. And if at any point you're contacting and then you start to push, I think that's really what most people are talking about when they're saying don't push punches. But having a hard punch and following through, I don't think that is a bad thing. Snapping is an inexplicit term. Doesn't really tell you very much. If you've got a stick and you snap it, it's obvious what that means. But when it comes to snapping a punch, it isn't so obvious. Do they mean they want to make a fast sound? Do they mean just get back very quickly? Always a very good idea. Or is there something else they're talking about? A lot of the time they'll end up just tapping the bag quite lightly, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that's not effective. There's a lot of boxers who do that, who are certainly far better than I am, but it doesn't mean there aren't times when people do that and it isn't the best way to deliver a punch. There are some bad examples out there. The first video I saw referring to this would have been Shane Fazan, and he has a very short video, about 3 minutes long, where he just says, don't push punches, you should snap punches. Only thing that's wrong with it, and this isn't against Shane Fazan, doesn't seem to make as many videos as he used to, but he used to have a change of location. I think I remember where I was, just talking about one example discussing pushing punches from Shane Fazan. But we can't talk about punches without something to punch, and the tree's had enough of that. So I'm just going to go and get my very old bag. It will take me a moment. This is the bag I use during my introduction video, and I'm well aware I need to make a better one of those. I don't have a hanging scale to weigh it from, so I had to use a person's scale, and best I could tell, it weighs about 75 kilos. Whew. And bringing it down here was hard work. Excuse me being out of breath. Oh, I've also noticed that whatever you're doing, now I'm out of breath, but even if you're very slightly out of breath with one of these underneath, you sound like you're out of breath all the time, and I might have to work on doing things a bit differently. Now, this example that Shane Fazan used of pushing a punch, as I say, just a very quick video. I think he's a brilliant video maker, taught me loads, so this shouldn't be interpreted as any kind of criticism of Shane Fazan. He talks about snapping a punch, and he just puts one in like that. Then pushing a punch, he does this, and he leaves it there. Well, if you're going to push a punch, you also want to bring it back. See, that's a push punch. Having the tree helps really, because when you've got a bag swinging, it really shows. I didn't think of it, but now I've got the tree here, it's going to be harder for a critic to say that's a push punch that's not being snapped, because it's not moving the bag as much. That wasn't supposed to be a part of the subject. This was an example of Shane Fazan talking about it, not giving a very good example of what's a pushing punch, and again, snapping punch doesn't necessarily mean very much. While looking into this, I looked at some discussions online, and there was something I saw that was really, really odd. Somebody talking about a snapping punch being when you get your hips involved. And my previous video talking about power and how many hinges you use discussed, and anybody could find out for themselves. You can snap a punch very lightly. That's a snapping punch, and it's not very powerful. There are times when you might want to punch like that. That's a snapping punch without using the hips. And you can use the hips and make a pushing punch. So there's a lot of people who will discuss a subject, and I don't think they have a very clear, uniform understanding of what a pushing punch is. And talking about snapping punches doesn't really mean much. When you put a lot of power into a hook, this is bags to go, let me come to the side a bit, you're going to use your hips, you're going to swivel, and that's very much like a push. You are going to be pushing onto contact with the bag because you've got more power. It's easy to just stand here. Is this what people want from a snap punch? It's not going to do much, and you won't find a lot of successful boxers doing it, or other types of fighter. Now, when you're going to put more power in, if you want to just connect briefly and then come back, you're going to have to use a lot of effort. You're putting lots of power into it and then using more power to remove that power on contact, just so you can say, I'm snapping my punches. I think this does go on. It's all a bit like heating up lots of water for a bath to 80 degrees centigrade and then putting lots of cold water in so you can get into it. And you might as well have just heated it up to 35 degrees to begin with. So if I'm going to pull a hard punch into this, where I'm using quite a few hinges, rotation, did I put it back fast enough to not call that a pushing punch? I pushed. If that bag was hanging, it would have gone quite far. There's a lot of funny habits that develop in gym culture, and I think one of them might be people sitting there, he's pushing his punches, do something about that. Definitely there's a lot of things that may be considered favourable or necessary inside a gym, and they're not necessarily going to encourage people to do the right thing. Maybe they're not very different sometimes to the sort of habits people have of mocking others in school. Now, I've talked about snapping, tapping, and bad examples. There's more about that as it goes along. Now, one thing that's important to mention is that you can't change physics. Doesn't matter who you are who's talking about this. You could be Muhammad Ali, you could be Scott Aspinall. Nearly got his name wrong there. I do know who he is, I watch his videos. You could be the most experienced coach of a boxer in the world. You can't change physics. That's just not possible. When your fist contacts an object, the more it makes that object move, the more it has an effect on that object, the more energy is imparted to that object. And as I've already said, if you use a lot of energy in a punch and you're so desperate to not push a few inches into the target that you're going to pull it back, a bit like as if you were trying to spar nice and gently but fast, a bit of an art in itself, then you're working hard to reduce the impact, just so you're not transferring so much energy. We've really got to look at why you don't want to push a punch, as they say, and it's because, I think, a couple of reasons. One is while your hand's out here, and I think this is why boxing coaches are generally saying don't push punches, because while you're out here pushing, you're not back here either defending or ready for another punch. And I'm sure that nobody can come up with a reason for pushing being bad in itself. It's just what you're not doing while you're pushing that will cause a problem. So if you're out there really pushing far, you're probably throwing your body off balance. But apart from that, you're not back here again. But if you are going to get back here very quickly, then the bill of a push, that was a push punch. It wasn't a tap, that's a tap. But then, as I've said, in explicit language, what do you mean when you're talking about a tap? Well, I think if you are contacting and imparting a fair bit of energy into the target, there's a lot of people saying, he's pushing those punches. And maybe there's a very good reason for it. In explicit language, now that the topics that I have here, it's supposed to keep me from rambling and going off subject, but what I'm actually doing today is jumping about a little bit anyway. But I'll get there. First video I've made for a while. So you can't change physics. The amount of energy you transfer into the target on contact will have a significant effect. It will determine how much damage you do to it, whether you knock the target out, whether you damage flesh and bone or not. And a lot of people talking about snapping punches, tapping, can be a lot of inexplicit language involved. Let's look at, I'm going to forget his name, and it's not deliberate, Tony, the Olympic boxer who makes good videos. And I do watch quite a few of his, and I've forgotten completely. He has a video talking about not pushing punches. No, he doesn't. He just says don't push your punches. I think he means don't push, keep out too far, don't do this. If you're pushing a punch like that, unless there's very specific circumstances, then you probably are not coming back to guard quickly enough, and you're leaving yourself vulnerable, and you're not going to have as many punches. You could look at the question, what's better? And this would be important in a minute, that or what's more effective? If you're in a situation where a lot of your punches won't hit, and that's often going to be the case, then the more punches you make, the more chances you've got that one or two of them will hit. Will come up, well, a few more details of that will come up in a moment or so. Next we've got punches in their correct place. And defense is very important again. And this is what I'm doing. I'm really mixing up subjects a little bit, and I should have been a bit more linear. But here goes anyway. You need to be back here to defend, so that's why you don't want to push out for too long. But then there might be a time when it's perfectly reasonable to stay out there, and it happens in boxing, but more in mixed martial arts, in UFC. You do see people in positions like this with their guard quite low, and it depends partly on what's happening, what the opponent's doing at the time. But sometimes it's a matter of looking for opportunities. A lot of the time, if you had your coach who's in your gym saying, don't you push your punches, snap your punches, he might have even read that somewhere. He might have heard somebody else saying it without fully understanding it. I think there's a lot more detail to these sort of things. But if you have a coach saying that, if he was watching a video, let's say we took a really skilled fighter and showed it to him and he didn't know who that fighter was, and he didn't know, and he was with familiar company, so he was being honest, he'll probably say, rubbish, he should have his guard up. Why is his guard not up? Why is he pushing punches? And it could be a fighter who would wipe the floor with this coach very easily. Very briefly, it's another subject, another comment I came upon when reading about this online, and one person said he thinks it's just what junior coaches say, boxing coaches. Just funnily enough, the other day I saw Sensei Seth. If you don't know about the YouTube combat sport fitness market, he's somebody who focuses on karate. He makes a lot of videos, good videos I think, but his teenage American language isn't quite what suits my preferences, put it that way, politely. He had an advert, and it was, I've forgotten again, Tony, I cannot remember his name. It was for a product he's involved with where it trains people to be boxing coaches, but are they really? It made it clear as it went on that there's sort of people who will work perhaps at corporate events or have people people who come to a gym. But it's boxer size. It does, of course, Tony's a great boxer. Like him very much. Love to meet him. He seems like the kind of person who you'd really enjoy having a beer with as well. But the man's got to make money, and it means that he might do things that are good for profit and business, and they're not necessarily always aimed towards the ideal pursuit of boxing, and nor should they be. You've got to make money out there. I'm going a long way about saying that because somebody has the words boxing coach associated with them doesn't mean that they have some mythical status. Doesn't even mean they're necessarily very good, but people overreact so much. He hates boxing coaches. No, loads of them are brilliant. Most of them perhaps are brilliant. Depends on where they are, what they're doing, who they're training, and what the expectations are from either party. But just because somebody is paid to teach other people something to do with boxing doesn't necessarily mean they're really very good at it, and they may never have had a fight. And back to this advert, the person, Sensei Seth, who's talking about it, talking about the product, which is where you can become a certified boxing trainer, he says you don't have to be a boxer, you don't have to be I'm paraphrasing, he implies, I think, that as long as you can give people something that makes them happy they came to you, then you're fine. And that's certainly how I interpreted it. Now, I was talking there about how you have punches in the correct places, and that can be an important factor is defense. You need to defend yourself, so you don't want to do anything like this when you need your hands back here. And again, in boxing in particular, it's often a matter of volume, and the more punches you get in, the more chance there is that one of them will catch them at the right time. And you can see this in matches, and you can sometimes see in matches when people are surprised that a punch did what it did, because with the best intentions, a fight is chaotic. And when I was younger, studying karate, I thought you go into a fight, you do this, and then you know what he's doing next, you do this, you block, and then you move into punch, and you're in control every second. Of course you're not. It took me a long time to realise that that's an unrealistic expectation, and half the time in boxing you're covering up because you know he could be coming from anywhere. You're not going to predict it, oh, I'll cover now, I'll cover now. It's impossible. Similarly, you're going to throw a lot of punches. You don't necessarily know which one of those is going to be the effective one that might get a win for you, and sometimes you see people surprised when they get a knockout. Power punches, similarly to defence, you will sometimes want a power punch that's really going to be effective, and you're putting more into it because you are going to faint, or perhaps just put in a couple of light jabs, you see your opponent move in a certain way that you know you can get a punch in. Perhaps he'll just drop his guard a little bit to cover up, and then you can get an overhead punch in. So you'll be going tap, tap. These are snap-in punches, if you like. Tap, tap, push. And that's necessary. If you just tap, 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 it might be because you don't have high expectations of that punch counting. But if you do, if you're watching their movement, they move in the right way, you know this punch is likely to hit, then it's worth it at that point of putting in a heavy one, because it's going to finish them, and a tap might not. And you might get the knockout at that point. It might finish the fight. That's something that was alive, and it's not very nice. And it wouldn't have happened if you just tapped them. That's setting up for a power punch. You might be trying to throw them off by hitting low. I think that's risky. See, if you're going to hit low and then throw a punch high and put everything into it, that might be just as risky as having done it anyway. But it depends on the circumstances, depends on the opponent, and it depends on what they're doing in response to you. But the main thing I'm trying to say so far is there are times when you want to push a punch harder. There's times when it will achieve what a snapping punch won't do, because it's, if you, as a pushing punch, you're talking about a punch that makes a bag swing, I can't do this from down here, then you can't redefine physics. Doesn't matter who you are. If somebody hits a bag and makes it swing 6 foot, that put more power into that punch than hitting the bag and it barely moving. There are perfectly good reasons that sometimes it's better to hit the bag and barely move it. Keep your guard close, be ready for another punch. But there are reasons when sometimes you want to really move it. And if you're really moving it, if you're really moving the person, if you're putting a lot of energy into it, then you're pushing that punch. Unless you're somebody, again, who means pushing a punch like this, because that's going too far. Or contacting and then pushing it. I knew somebody who did this. I wonder if any of my old friends who are watching this, if you are, thank you, remember this. Guy we went to school with called Ben. I've got a good friend called Ben, not him, not you. And he used to do something like this. This isn't moving, so it won't really show it. And he actually used to put his fist at a funny angle. It's a different subject. That was going much, much too far. Now, what's really important in this discussion is what's boxing specific. And boxing is a large part of combat sport. I don't think it's a large part of combat, because it's not quite combat. A good boxer is going to beat the hell out of me whatever I'm doing, so I'm not saying otherwise. And often the average person, depending on the person, size, aggression, lots of things like that. Boxing isn't fighting. One thing that I really noticed going back some way now with Conor McGregor and Floyd Mayweather, I don't think many people who know a lot about fighting would argue that Floyd Mayweather wouldn't have stood much of a chance against Conor McGregor in MMA. In fact, it's stupid to him to say, of course he wouldn't. He wouldn't do it for exactly that reason. Boxing, if you're being hit, let's say the person hitting me is here and I've had enough, I've only got to do that and he's going to stop hitting me, or he better stop hitting me or he's in trouble with the referee. I can't do that all match. Maybe I could if I was called Mayweather, who knows? That's a matter of opinion. But that is how it works. You can't do that in a real fight. That's just one example of how different it is. It doesn't really affect this subject. But what does affect this subject is, in boxing, it's so chaotic because you're not grabbing hold of anyone, or you're only doing so for short periods. You're not grappling with them. You're not kicking them. When it's just the punches, sometimes people are just going to cover up. You can't do that if you're being kicked. You can't do that in a different sort of fight. What that means is, in boxing, there's going to be much of the time, I'd like to think it's fair to say all the time, there's going to be far more punches thrown. they're going to be fast, and I think the person throwing them isn't going to be as careful about how he's punching, where he's punching, as he would if he didn't have gloves on, if he had lighter gloves on, and if he had to also defend against other things. You can't do a flurry of combinations high up when you've also got to watch your lower half. In boxing, there are so many punches being thrown, you are going to throw a lot of light punches. I'm here and here's my target. If I know he's moving well, he's covering up, so I don't know which of these is actually going to get in somewhere, I'm going to want to throw a lot of punches, and I don't want to put too much into them. If I do that, I'm only going to get half the amount of punches in, and I'll tire myself out a lot more quickly. But in a lot of combat sports, and perhaps combat in real life, that doesn't happen. You don't have the protection. You can't pepper punches, swarm punches if you like. You're going to be a lot more specific, and you're going to take your time to make sure you're not hurt when you do the punch, but also to make sure that you put as much into it as possible. So if you're being more careful with punch placement, you're more likely to say, right, I'm going to put everything into this and really try to hurt him, rather than don't know if it's going to hit or not, so I better do that and one of them will hit. Nothing there is criticism of boxing, it's just saying it's a different sport, it's something you're doing differently. And it doesn't necessarily reflect combat. Right, that's most of it, and I don't think I'm doing bad for time, but without the time, I don't know. As well as look at some examples of pushing punches, people discussing it, and people talking about not doing it, I've watched a lot of fights. I watch a lot of fights anyway. I don't watch fights when they're live. It might not be the case now, but when I last checked it was. In Britain, if you want to do that, you've got to subscribe to something like Sky Sports. And I would feel that I'm wasting money, because I would only ever watch UFC events. Maybe occasional boxing. I'm happier. I don't have to see something live, don't care. I'm happier to watch it afterwards when it's on YouTube. And I watch a couple of fights most days, not every day. And then some days I watch quite a lot of them. 3 examples I picked up anyway. Boxing first, Tyson Fury versus Usyk, don't know his first name. You watch that, and there's pushed punches. Fury, a couple of push punches when he's going quite high. Here, we're not talking about a push being... That's losing balance. But we're talking about a push, you put in a lot into it, and when you hit the target, your fist is going to keep moving for a little while. A few inches. Not often more than a few inches, but it could be. You see Fury throwing some, overhand quite high usually. Usyk, he's throwing some at the body, and he's pushing those punches. He has to. Look at the size of the man he's fighting. He could not do anything that really hurts Fury with snapping punches. It's just not really going to happen. Whereas I would say Fury could have a fairly light snap and hit Usyk, and it would be very effective. You could look back at that fight, and as I say, in particular in the body, you'll find quite a few push punches from Usyk. Now then, back to Shane Fazan, and I'm going to forget a name in a minute, or get it not quite right. Shane Fazan sparred Firas Zahawi. It sounds as if I'm being disrespectful. I don't like it when I forget people's names, but it's not. I do respect him. I saw him talking to Joe Rogan first. Interesting conversation. I respect the man tremendously, but when he started saying just because you put a coin in your hand and you flip it and it's still a coin 100 times in a row doesn't mean the next time you do it a butterfly won't come out. I think he was trying to explain something about philosophy, and he didn't do it very well under the circumstances. I'm sure he had good intentions. I've got so much confidence in him that when Devon Luat, the arm wrestler, was fighting Hafthor because Eddie Hall had an injury, I thought there was hardly any chance until I found out that Firas was involved, and it turned out to be misplaced. Give Devon Luat credit, but it wasn't It wasn't an even fight, and it was stopped pretty soon. But just for a moment or two, I remember thinking, oh well, if anyone can do it, can teach him, that's the man who can do it. Anyway, Shane Fazan had a spar with Firas, and it was one-sided entirely. And Firas, I think he was being reasonable. I'm sure they agreed about the amount of force they were going to use beforehand, but he was pushing Fazan about, and there were some push punches involved. Another one you could have a look at. Firas knows what he's doing. And last of all, a more recent one, we've got Sean Strickland versus Israel Adesanya. I think so, something like that. You see, I tend to see fights a lot. Sometimes it's just the highlights and things. So and if I see a fight after the event, I don't sit there, and I wouldn't. It's why I don't want to watch them live, talking about them coming out, all the spectacular show business side of it. Not interested. I just want to see the fight. That's why I don't hear their names a lot, because I'm just watching the fight. And a lot of the time those bits will be cut out. Anyway, Strickland and Adesanya, there were push punches in that fight. Not most of them. It's very different in MMA, and I think that people who are saying don't push punches, maybe they just watch boxing, I don't know. But in MMA, it's something I've started to notice. I've noticed this with Strickland. There's no perfect stance, perfect positioning. You never move out. Sometimes they're like this, waiting. Am I doing this? Am I moving this way? And they're very open. Don't have to look at anything recent for that. Bas Rutten used to fight very open, and it's because he wants to be able to really put his hips in, twist into punches, and it's also because he wants to tempt them to come to him so he can move out the way and then respond. And that can be effective. You've got to be good to do it. If I was having a fight, I've sparred, I've fought, not in a ring, not professionally. If I was having a fight soon, I'd cover up. I'd cover up, and unless I saw that I was able to move them in a way that they drop their guard, I wouldn't be throwing power punches. But I'm not a very experienced professional. When you are, you expect a much higher standard, and they do know what they're doing. Sometimes they're taking a gamble. Here's something that's important. You could be one of the best in the world, but there's still unpredictable elements, and I think you could have two people who are ranked very highly. If they had 10 fights, take a long time to do that, otherwise they wouldn't be in shape for it, then the one who's generally slightly better wouldn't win 10 times in a row. You can just make a wrong move sometimes. I'm not at all suggesting it's down to chance. That would be ridiculous. But even if you're better, if you do the wrong thing, it can really put you in trouble. It's because it's combat sport. It's furious. It's chaotic. I think that's about it. I forgot to do it as I was going along, so let's just put the chapters up, as it were, because I spent a bit of time making the files. So what we've looked at is punch fundamentals, part 2.5, what's a push, snapping, tapping, and bad examples. Then we have the fact that you can't change physics, that if you're punching a bag and you're sending it flying, you've put more energy into that. You've used more force than if you're just tapping it. Sometimes it's a good time to tap it. And under that we have energy transfer and inexplicit language, which is where when Tony says push your punches, when he says snap your punches, don't push your punches, exactly what does he mean by that? A lot of people aren't very explicit, aren't very clear. I'm sure I'm one of them. Somebody can be a brilliant boxer, and it doesn't mean he necessarily explains things very well. I was going to make a comparison to something else, but it's really a bit late in the video for that. Energy transfer and explicit language. Then we have punches in their correct place, and defense. You might need to pull a punch back very fast for defense. For setup for another punch, you might set up and then want to push a power punch. And there are reasons specific to boxing in particular that mean that you will want to have higher volume, lower power punches, and that might be more advantageous to you. And last of all, we had the examples. maybe you've got not much to do for an hour tonight, and you can go and have a look. Fury versus Usyk, Faison versus Firas, and Strickland versus Adesanya. Just a little bit about me. I haven't made a video for a while. It was a bit difficult to do this because I planned it a few weeks ago, didn't get around to it. I'm really trying to be a bit more consistent with my lifting schedule. It's going pretty well. I've got 2 days left to do for this week, and then 5 days for next week, and then I'm going to have a deload. That would be only after 5 weeks. I know people sometimes have longer programs. I'm going to have a deload for a week, and I think I'll try to in that week have 2 sessions where I'll just do compound movements with 30 or up to 40 of everything with just a bar, 20 kilos or thereabouts. And then I'll try some PRs, and I hope I'll do it. When I took the pull-up, I just wanted to get a number down on the sheet, and I just did 5 and 6 this way. I've since done 7 each way, coming on for an 8th. So I'm improving. It's definitely working out. I want to make more videos, not fewer videos. It's difficult to find the time, so I've got to try to integrate it into the training more. Come and make a video for 5 minutes in between squat set, deadlift set. Because I really do want to keep doing this. I've learned a few things. People don't like videos about swords very much. People aren't as interested in videos, well, I've only made one, but regarding crossbows, went a bit wrong anyway. Yeah, medieval equipment doesn't really seem to interest people that much. I still want to make some reviews because I think they're really helpful if you're thinking of buying that thing, but it's only then they really help. Right, that's it then. I am going to make one soon looking at combinations, where I've got 8 to 10 combinations that I made up a very long time ago. It might be interesting to look at them and see which of them are effective and which aren't. I just wanted to look at combinations first, but I thought that's a good way to do it. I made them 11 years ago and I didn't know what I was doing, so 1 or 2 of them might be good, some of them will be terrible, and I'll score them, and perhaps you can do the same, and we'll see if we agree. That's it then. I hope I've explained that pushing punches isn't necessarily evil, and I did forget to say, and I will now, there are some martial arts where you focus quite heavily on pushing punches. Boxing is not the be-all and end-all. And outside of a boxing ring with boxing rules, I don't think a boxer necessarily is going to be using the most effective combat style. I'm always careful with words. Nobody go away saying, he's saying boxers are terrible. I'm saying that the boxer might not necessarily be the best combatant if you're in the UFC, if there's a fight in real life, but fights in real life are a mess. They really are. Could talk a bit about that one day. I've had a bit of experience. I know people have had more. And the only way you win a fight in real life is by not getting in it. And that's the case in 2024 more than ever before. Self-defense starts by not being there. And I've gone on for enough. Well, I hadn't made a video for a while, so had to get out of my system. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Hopefully it will be no more than a week. And that's it then. My name's Mark. Cheers.